And I'm really happy to be able to be with you all here in person in the building, and also everyone who is online right now. Hello to you. Great to have you joining us today. We are moving through some episodes in Jesus' life in Mark's Gospel at the moment. And Beth just shared a few verses where Jesus talks in parables. And Jesus did this a lot. He often talked about God in parables, and that's the word that we have in the text. That's the word he uses, a parable. It's a bit of a strange word, but it means an image or a little story that is designed to stick in people's minds, that people can just take away with them and ponder, a way to communicate a big truth in a simple way to lots of people. And this was Jesus' preferred mode of talking about God. And the fact that we have 40 different parables of Jesus in the Gospels, that is evidence that they worked. They were really effective. People were obviously challenged and changed when they heard them. They obviously generated followers of Jesus. And those followers obviously came to consider the parables as really central to how they remembered Jesus, how they understood who Jesus was. Now, who here would say that they're quite familiar with Jesus' parables? If I say, tell me, why don't we just shout out a few of Jesus' parables? Parable of the, anyone? Sower, yeah, anyone else? Talents, yeah. Lost sheep. Lost coin. So there are loads. There's 40. I mean, I won't try and get all 40 just by doing this now, but Jesus gave lots of these parables, and lots of us here will kind of know them. We'll kind of be familiar with these parables. So here's a question for you. Those of us here who would say you know the parables. Is it just me, or are quite a lot of these parables quite dull? Like they're not much fun? I probably shouldn't say that, wearing one of these at the front of church, but like they're kind of about really normal, slightly boring things. So the first one that we just heard just now, Jesus says, the kingdom of God is like when a man scatters seed on the ground, then gradually it grows, and then eventually he harvests the crops. Okay. The second one, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, which is very small, but then you plant it and it grows into a big tree. Is it just me, or are these quite sort of unprovocative images? If I posted a picture on Instagram of, a seed, or even if I put a really nice filter on it, a mustard seed, or even a mustard tree, or even a pot of mustard, not many people would like my photo. They'd think, why are you posting about mustard? Or if I film myself a 10-second video sowing some seeds and put it on TikTok, that video would get close to 0 views, I suspect. Because these are seriously normal, non-exciting, even boring things that Jesus is talking about. And in fact, and part of the reason for that is that they were likely just the things that happened to be in front of his eyes at that moment. We're told earlier in this chapter that Jesus is at Lake Galilee. Can we have the slide up, please? I've got a slide of Lake Galilee viewed from the shore. There it is. And he's standing in a boat while delivering these parables, and the boat has been pushed out a little way onto the lake, and he's teaching to a large crowd gathered back on the shore. Which sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? Like, why would you go and get in a boat in order to teach people who are standing on the shore? But Jesus was surrounded by fishermen, people living around Galilee. They were a fishing culture. Everyone knew how the lake worked, how the water worked, and everyone knew that that was a sensible thing to do, to get out in that boat. Because sound travels further over open water. Speaking of sound, is my microphone okay, or is it too loud? It's a bit too loud. Could we have it down a bit, please? Thank you. Yeah. People in this fishing culture would have known that sound travels further over open water, like a lake. There's generally a temperature inversion immediately above a body of open water, so it's cold immediately above the surface, and then it gets warmer as you go up. And because sound travels more slowly in hot air and travels quickly in cold air, this temperature inversion effectively kind of squeezes and funnels the sound horizontally along the channels of cool air directly above the lake's surface. And in this case, straight from Jesus' mouth to the people standing on the shore. So Jesus is standing in this boat. The vibrations from his voice are carrying clearly and quickly to his listeners, the crowd. And behind the crowd, he would have seen gentle hillsides of arable land, grass, trees, and shrubs. So given that setting, given that's where we know Jesus was while he was speaking, it is likely that the field of corn and the mustard tree that Jesus talks about were real. It is likely that once there was an actual field and an actual mustard tree by Lake Galilee that Jesus saw and said, oh yeah, the kingdom of God is like that. When God's in charge, it's like that. Now, I think that's all quite interesting and exciting even. It reminds us that this stuff is real, that Jesus was a real person, and that what we read in the text of the Bible like that, it's talking about stuff that happened in history, in a physical space. But still, corn and mustard, like they're not the most exhilarating, heart-stoppingly amazing items, are they? And if I had been given the job in that moment to fire people up about the kingdom of God, I wouldn't have gone for corn or mustard. I probably would have gone something a bit more exciting, like jaguars or I don't know, what else is exciting? An iPad or diamonds or something like that. You know, something that people like, something that is like, wow, yes, the kingdom of God. Something impressive. But Jesus didn't do that. So what is he trying to say about God by talking like this, about talking about corn and mustard? Is he trying to say that God's really normal, that God's really boring? Well, I think he's trying to say something quite important. And it comes out if we dive into the words of Jesus a little bit more closely and see. So are you ready to do a little bit of biblical studies? Are you ready to go deep into this text right now? Give me a thumbs up. Yes. For those of you who are not, sorry, it won't take that long. So let me just read the text again. This is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it, because the harvest has come. Let's stop there. That's the first parable. And it's verse 28 in there that I want to draw your attention to. Could I have the next slide, please? There we go. Mark 4:28. After 3, why don't we just read this out all together? Okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay, sorry to do that to you. Anyone know what this language is? Greek, yes, it's the language of the New Testament. This is Greek, and I'm going to teach you some Greek right now. So that first word is pronounced like this, automati. That little next word goes he. The next word is gi, like a g sound, and then the final one is karpophori. Automati, he, gi, karpophori. It's kind of got a nice little poetic lilt to it. And in our Bibles, that's translated, all by itself, the soil produces grain. But what it literally says is, can I have the next slide, please? The automatic ground bears fruit. The automatic ground bears fruit. That's a really strange way of talking, isn't it? That's quite a weird way of saying it. You kind of get what he means, but why put it like that? But it is true, isn't it? The ground is automatic. Soil is automatic. It just grows things like that. You don't have to do anything. As Jesus says, night and day, whether the sower sleeps or gets up, it still grows. That is, you could stay in bed all day for all the ground cares. The ground doesn't care. It will still grow the seed. It's automatic. And if all of Balham decided to take a nice few months of hibernation or something and just retreat into our houses for a few months, by the time we came out, the ground would have done its thing. Balham would be turning into a forest. Walls would be crumbling. There would be plants and trees everywhere breaking through because the ground is automatic. It doesn't care what we humans do. The ground does its job without anyone asking. It grows stuff. And throughout the Bible, we are told that this is what God is like. And you'll see it almost on every single page of the Bible expressed in some way or other. We're told that God is steadfast, that God doesn't change, that God keeps his promises, that God is faithful. All different ways of saying that God is automatic. God does the job of being God reliably, without compromise, and all of the time, whether we like it or not. God just does the job of being God. And throughout the Bible, we also see that there's a pattern to this, that God doing the job of being God looks a certain way. There's a certain pattern to God's automatic action that recurs again and again and again. And if you flick through the Bible, you see it. God is the God who, in the very beginning, takes nothing, a formless void, and creates everything. God is the God who chooses a minuscule, marginal Middle Eastern people group, Israel, as his people, through whom he will come and be with the whole world, through whom he will bless the whole world. God is the God who chooses the youngest son, never the eldest. God always chooses the youngest son, not the heir. God is the God who chooses a prostitute, Rahab, to enable his chosen people to enter their promised land. God is the God who uses scared people, weak people, to be prophets and to speak the truth and act on God's behalf. And God is the God who becomes a fragile fetus in a teenager's womb to rescue the world. And then God is the God who takes the cruel, embarrassing death of a ruined man, Jesus, and uses it to defeat death and pave the way for life for everyone. Do you see the pattern? You could summarize it in a variety of ways, but there is this recurring pattern, this automatic pattern of God turning rubbish into treasure. God turning rubbish into treasure. When you take waste, the stuff that everyone else would throw out or ignore or avoid, you take it and you chuck it into God, it grows. And Jesus says that in this way, God's like the ground, God's like soil. And the kingdom of God is like throwing almost invisibly puny seeds into the dirt and just watching them grow automatically into magnificent crops and trees. And God is this dirt. God is this fertile dirt, this automatic ground. Whatever rubbish that you chuck into it, it grows into treasure. This is God. And his kingdom, the outposts of his kingdom are established when people, like you and me, choose to chuck our rubbish in there too. When we plant our own dirty and bruised feet in God's soil, because when we do, God is automatic. God can just get on and do his thing, get on with being God, turning our rubbish into treasure. And sometimes that happens very slowly, sometimes that happens very quickly, but it happens. That's what God does. That's his kingdom. And that now is the trajectory of the whole of history. That's Christian hope. Christian hope is being excited that that's where we're going. That this gradual transformation into treasure, into God's kingdom here on earth. That's God being in charge. And so what about Jesus? Where's he come into all of this? Well, was he just a man? Was he just a guy who told the truth about God? No, he was more than that. Jesus was the soil being laid in the world. God laying his soil in the world for us. Sometimes in London, you'll be going through somewhere in the inner city or through a gloomy urban area, maybe quite oppressive buildings, flats piled on top of each other, not much space, not much sky. But every once in a while, you'll suddenly walk past an allotment. Who has an allotment near them? Anyone? Yeah? There's a couple near where we live. You'll walk past an allotment, and it's just at this time of year in particular, this stunning oasis of colour and life and growth just pressed in amongst an estate or next to a little park or wherever. And it's glorious to see all of that colour and life nestled amidst the concrete. And Jesus was God with us, 100% human, 100% God. And in him, his life, his death, and his resurrection, it was a bit like that. God laying an allotment right in the middle of the poverty and struggle of the city, right in the middle of our world. God has laid that soil right there, blazingly obvious, for everyone and anyone to go and get stuck into, go and get planted into. And if you're a Christian, you have said yes to that. You've decided that you are going to take your shoes off and you are going to plant your bare feet in Jesus' soil. You've planted yourself in God. And life from now on for you is trust. It's learning to abandon yourself, completely handing yourself over to God to be in charge of you and your rubbish and turn it into treasure. And I really love the image that Jesus uses at the end of the passage we've just read to describe what this results in. In verse 32, he says that the mustard tree grows up from the seed, and then birds come and nestle in the spreading branches of the tree and just enjoy its shade. It's a beautiful image that speaks of freedom and rest and enjoyment and fullness of life. And that is where God leads us. That's where God grows us, when we let him be in charge. And I think I actually know what it might be like to be one of those birds, a little bit. When I was growing up, my family would often go and stay with my grandparents, who lived on a farm in Kent. My grandfather spent his life as a farmer there. And there was a huge barn right next to their house. And if it was the right time of year, in this barn, there would be a massive pile of wheat, of grains of wheat, piling all the way up to the ceiling, so that you could literally walk all the way up to the top and touch the ceiling of this massive barn. This was wheat that had been harvested from the fields and was waiting to be sold. And my sisters and I, our parents just let us loose on this wheat. And it was the most idyllic, intensely fun experience. And we just spent hours running up it, burying ourselves into it, making wheat angels. Has anyone ever made a wheat angel? No, that's unique to me. I've done it. It's great. And best of all, going all the way to the top and then sliding all the way from the top down to the bottom, from the roof to the floor. It was really, really fun. And personally speaking, when I think of the kingdom of God, I think of that, of those minuscule, individually almost worthless grains of wheat. And sometimes they were worthless. Sometimes they were too wet, so they couldn't sell them. And there was this massive pile of grain, and they just had to feed it to the cows in the end, because no one would buy it. These tiny, almost worthless grains of wheat, piled up to the ceiling for me and my sisters to slide down. And we were like the birds in the branches of the mustard tree, sampling the joys of the shade. The worthless becomes priceless. Rubbish becomes treasure. That's the pattern here. And if you want a concrete example of that, Well, it's actually blazingly obvious right in front of us, I think. If you just look back over the past year here, in this church, but also in other churches, we've seen that we've been dealing with something really, really rubbish, haven't we? A life-destroying virus that has just arrested and trapped the whole world. It's rubbish. But as a community here at Ascension, we have tried to plant ourselves in God and to plant all of our coronavirus-related rubbish in God as well. We've tried to firmly keep it with God, in God. We've tried to give it to Him. We've chucked all of this rubbish in His soil. And can you believe what has happened? If you take a moment to think about it, it's unbelievable. I can barely believe it. Over the past year, think what has grown out of this rubbish. Well, just earlier this morning, we had Bubble Church. Has anyone ever experienced Bubble Church? It's amazing. It's so good. We've got a new congregation of about 100 people who now come to church and love being here and singing and worshiping God together. Babies and parents. Where did that come from? It came from this rubbish. Bubble Church was a response to the pandemic, response to rubbish. And what else? The employment course, rework. We've run this employment course twice now. We've seen people get back into work. We're just starting a debt advice service that is now up and running. We had our first in-person client come recently, last week, I think. We can now live stream our services so that people can join in with these services, with funerals, with weddings from all corners of the globe. And that's just kind of scraping the surface. There's been such transformation over this past year, such incredible treasure emerging from the rubbish. And 1 year ago, or a bit more, 1 year ago, I wouldn't have believed it. It was just unimaginable. Where on earth has all of this come from? Well, it's come from absolute rubbish, planted in God. Absolute rubbish. The worst hand we could have been dealt. A global pandemic. Rubbish. And it wasn't God's will. Suffering and sin and pain is not God's will, ever. Evil and pain and rubbish, it's like a lack. It's not something. It's not something that God makes or causes. It's an absence of life. But nonetheless, God can do something with it. In God's soil, it becomes something. It sprouts shoots of life, and it grows, and it becomes treasure. And I know many of us here have experienced that pattern in their own life. Perhaps you have. God choosing the worst bit, the hardest bit, as the place to do the growing, to change you, to bring out the treasure. And for me, I won't go into the details of it, but I've experienced that too. The worst year of my life was the academic year of 2009 over to 2010. It wasn't tragically terrible, but it was definitely the worst year of my life so far. It was rubbish. But it was that year, those precious months, that God seized upon and made something amazing out of. It was that year that I fell in love with Jesus and began to properly trust Him for the first time. And it was that year that's led to everything else ever since for me. So I can vouch for the fact that rubbish and God actually go quite well together. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to try it, to suspend your disbelief for a while and just try it and trust. Jesus invites you to do that. I'm encouraging you to do that, to plant your rubbish into God, to pray and to invite God. Tell Him, talk to Him, be honest with Him about what you want. Let Him be in charge of your life. And ask Him to turn your rubbish into treasure. And we all have a lot of rubbish in our lives. So I want you to just think of some of it now and give it over to God. We're going to have a time of prayer. We're going to have a song that's going to play. You're welcome to worship with that song, to join in with that, or to just take this time to choose a piece of rubbish, take it to God, bury it in his soil.